Hello everybody, welcome back to Daniel's Side of the Story, where I go through that week's chapter of the story, and I share some of my thoughts or reflections that I had as I read through that week's chapter, just to help spark some discussion, maybe in your home or in your small group, or maybe just give you a new perspective to personally reflect on your own time as you work through the story with the rest of your church family. This is week 29, and this week we're taking a look at some of Paul's missionary journeys as he moves throughout the Roman Empire. Now, when we go through the book of Acts in Scripture, we can see that Paul travels a lot throughout his ministry, and the story condenses his whole journey into around 30 pages, so there's lots that can be unpacked. Now, I don't know about you, but in this chapter, it can be a little bit confusing if you don't take the time to maybe pull out some maps or take the time to remember who some of the people are that we read about. And because this chapter is filled with so many strange names, of people or places, if you aren't careful, you can kind of get caught up just reading and kind of go, okay, so Paul went to some place, talked with some Jews, some Gentiles, and then he left and he went to another place, so on and so forth. Big deal. But if you take the time and you learn who some of these people are, or where some of these cities are, or what they're like, you begin to realize that these are real people, just like you and me. And each city is unique and special in so many different ways. It's not just words on a page. These are lives. These are cities and societies. And we can also recognize that Paul uses a number of different tactics to share the gospel with his audience, and he actually changes up his delivery style depending on where he is and who is listening to him. He recognizes that he can't just use the same tactics for every single group, because it would just be less effective. And if instead maybe he'd be able to kind of personalize each and every message depending on the people that are listening to him. So I encourage you just to take some time to learn even the basics of the context for some of these places. Learn and understand, what's this place like? Who is this person? What's their connection? It doesn't take too long in order to get just a general understanding or knowledge. And again, using some of the resources and maps can be very helpful for that as well. I know for me personally, being able to see it makes it a lot easier. But going back to the story though, there's one particular moment in this chapter that I want to talk about. And we can see on page 424 that Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he mentions 4 individuals. So on page 424 he says, "My brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is this: one of you says, 'I follow Paul'; another, 'I follow Apollos'; another, 'I follow Cephas'; still another, 'I follow Christ.'" Now, Paul is addressing some sort of situation of division within the church in Corinth, where people are coming under these different factions and fighting against one another, kind of saying, no, this church leader is who I follow. And Paul is speaking against this, but we can see that there are a few. We see these 4 individuals, and I want to draw your attention to the people that he mentions. Now, I'm going to assume that you know who Paul and Christ are, and I also want to remind you, Cephas is also known as Peter, and he's one of Jesus' closest friends. But the odd man out, really, is Apollos. Who is Apollos, really? And actually, we read a little bit about Apollos earlier in the chapter. And personally, as I've been going through the book of Acts over the past number of weeks, I've read a little bit about Apollos, and I think he's an amazing character. So I want to take some time to dig into his story. In this story itself, in our storybooks, we see that Apollos is introduced on page 420. And we learn that Apollos is a Jew. He's from Alexandria in Egypt, and he's well taught, having a deep understanding of Scripture. We also know that Apollos is very clearly passionate about God, and he teaches the people about Jesus. And, he has this fervor Scripture describes. And yet we also see that Apollos didn't have all of his information up to date. They said he really was teaching up until the baptism of John. And he had missed some important areas of the story. So we see here a character who has a lot of zeal, a lot of passion, and is really a go-getter for God. And he's giving his all to God, but he doesn't do it perfectly. He makes some critical mistakes because he doesn't know the whole story. And then, as Apollos is going around teaching, he meets up with some different listeners, and one of the people who listen, well, two people would be Aquila and Priscilla, a husband and wife that are friends of Paul. And they hear Apollos, and they recognize that he needs some help because he doesn't have the whole picture. And so what they do is they take him aside and they explain, a more fitting, a more appropriate, more up-to-date version of the story. I can imagine, Apollos is someone who hears some of the words of Jesus maybe, and he gets excited and he goes out and he starts teaching about Jesus, which is good, but he was away. He didn't hear the story of Jesus' death, his resurrection, and so many other things that he taught. So Aquila and Priscilla, they take him aside and they start to explain some of these things. And after Apollos is kind of put in a right place, he continues his journey, and this time he's teaching he's teaching with a proper understanding of Jesus, and he begins to teach that message instead. And we find out that Apollos was actually a pretty amazing teacher and a leader after this moment, and Paul described how people are following his teaching on the same level as himself, Paul, as well as Peter and even Jesus. So we know that Apollos grew to be quite an influential and significant member in the early church. So Apollos grows prominent. He's known as kind of like one of these big four that Paul talks about. And yet when we take a look at him, at the big picture of Apollos' story, we see that he actually shares a lot of similarities with Paul's big picture story too. And here's what I mean. Both of these individuals are well educated, they're passionate for God, and they're doing what they believe is right, and yet they fail to understand a critical aspect of the upper story, and they need to be corrected on that. Now, for both of these characters, after they receive this correction and their trajectories fixed, realigned to match God, they both continue on to teach God's message with the same level of passion, if not more. And I think this is something that we can learn from today. These guys didn't have all of the answers, and they make some pretty big mistakes. If you remember, Paul was also known as Saul of Tarsus, and he was one of the early church's biggest threats for a time. He was actually persecuting the church. That's a pretty big mistake. And yet, both of them listened to correction. For Apollos, it was Aquila and Priscilla, and for Paul, Jesus himself appeared before him. But they both received some form of correction, and then they pressed on after they were set on the right path again. Both of these people loved God, and even when they made mistakes, they acted out of their current understanding of God. Again, Paul made some mistakes, and he was off by quite a bit at some points, but he did what he thought was right, and he needed to be corrected. And for us, I think that's something we can learn from. We can learn from that passion. When we experience God's presence and we grow closer to Him, it's only natural for us to want to share that kind of joy with others. Apollos, Paul, Peter, and everyone else needs to listen for God's correction, because we're human. We're going to make mistakes, and we aren't going to know everything perfectly. And because we make mistakes, sometimes horrible mistakes, we need that correction. But that doesn't mean that we should just sit around and wait until we're perfect before we can share the gospel. Apollos didn't know the full story, but he had other believers around him who loved him enough to take him aside and to correct his teaching so that he could teach the message even better. They didn't pull him aside and say, "You need to stop teaching, you don't understand what you're talking about." They said, "Hey, I see you know part of the story. Let me show you another side of it. Let me show you more that you haven't heard yet. Because I see that you want to serve God. You want to do great things for Jesus. Let me show you how you can do that even better." Apollos didn't know the full story. None of us do. But when we support one another and we encourage one another, teach one another, we can grow stronger together, growing a community that loves, follows, and shares Jesus. So I have to ask you, are you serving God with all of your heart like Apollos or Paul? And are you accepting correction in your own life when someone brings it to you? Apollos and Paul, they both served God and they accepted correction. And today they're known as valuable leaders in the early church who brought countless people to Jesus. What will you be remembered for? That's really what I want to talk about today, and we're already running a little over on time. But thank you for listening. I hope that this gets you thinking about how God is working in the story, in the lives of some of these characters, like Apollos, and also how He may be working in your life today, how we can take these lessons that we learn in Scripture and apply them in our own lives so that we can grow personally closer to Jesus and also help others grow closer to Him as well. Thanks for listening, and until next week, bye for now.